My name is Charles Zach. I'm 66 years old. I've lived in Burlington all my life. I've had various occupations throughout my life. Starting in Burlington, my first job here was helping farmers pick some of their crops in the summertime on Maple Avenue when it was still farmland. My current job is I'm a government lobbyist for Canada's National Firearms Association. I've been a HR manager, I've been in IT, and I've been in architecture. So my mother and father both grew up in the northwestern regions of Hungary, and it was under communist rule after the Second World War. So during that time, Hungary was oppressed by the Soviet Union, and it became very hard there for people to thrive and subsist even. My father's background, his father was in the Hungarian army, and he was treated with prejudice by the Soviets for obvious reasons. He was prevented from going to school, upper school. His family business was confiscated, and they endured a lot of oppression, and many people there did. And that culminated one day in 1956 in October into a full-blown revolution, because the Soviets were, and their proxies in Hungary, were abusing the people, up to and including murder. So the people rose up and they fought against the Soviets and the Hungarian proxy forces, and unfortunately was defeated. My father took part in that revolution directly. I'm not going to go into details, but he was part of the regional resistance. So when they knew that the revolution was not going to succeed, my father knew that his life now was in jeopardy and in peril. So he was dating my mother at the time. He was 22, 23 years old. My mother was 18 years old. He basically returned from the city and asked my mother whether or not he wanted to escape with my father across the border, because it was still open to Austria, and she eagerly applied. So they landed in Austria. Austria gave them refuge and sent them off to a refugee camp in Steyr. So at that point, they contemplated immigrating as refugees. So my mother had family in California. My father had relatives here in Hamilton in Canada. And funny story is that first my mother's application was accepted to go to California, but because my mother and father weren't married at the time, my father couldn't go. So my mother said, no, we're going together, not separately. So they got married here in Steyr. Well, the offer to immigrate to the U.S. had expired at that point, so the application from Canada came in saying, you're welcome to come to Canada. And my uncle, they sponsored my mother and father to come across. He landed at Pier 21, and they were processed. So they were checked medically, and I think they were given $20 and train tickets to anywhere in Canada, and they were on their way. And that was the extent of the support. Right, so they had one suitcase that basically had nothing but pictures and some prized linens that my mother had made and was passed down from her family, but otherwise they had nothing. They left everything behind: property, family, and their culture. So they landed in Canada, not knowing the language. It was a brand new start, very daunting. Mm-hmm. So they landed up in Hamilton, and my uncle tried to get my father jobs here and there. So at that point, my father was working for the city, cutting trees, doing all kinds of different things, odd jobs, trying to find anything good to support his young family. One day he heard from another friend that there was a brand new brick plant being built on number 5 highway, Canada Brick. Actually, it was called Diamond Clay at that point. And so in the middle of the winter time, he jumped on his bike and rolled all the way from Leyland Avenue up Brant Street to number 5 highway down to Appleby Line on number 5 in the middle of a snowstorm to try to apply for a job. In the meantime, while he's going down this road, the big black car goes by him, and they're kind of looking at him. He took notice of that, and he finally ended up at the plant and saw the same black car parked outside. So he went inside, and he asked to see the boss, and Mr. Henderson came out, and he looked at him and going, "How did you get here?" He goes, "Well, I drove my bike." "Was that the guy? Was you the guy that I passed on the road?" He goes, "Yes." He goes, what do you want?" He goes, "I want a job." He goes, "You're hired." So just the pure tenacity of going to the plant. So my dad spent his entire life there. Yeah. Unfortunately, it ended prematurely. He was in a truck crash in Hamilton delivering bricks about 27 years ago. But, back then we still had cradle to grave jobs, and that plant was very good to my dad and our family. It helped us thrive and build our house and everything else, right? So we in between that we lived on Leyland. So we moved in 1960 and 1422 Leyland, and it was an old farmhouse with a good acre property in the back, and my family transformed it into a mini farm, as many families did back then. So we had everything back there, everything from potatoes to lettuce to watermelon to peppers to tomatoes, everything you possibly could need. So and my mother was very much into canning, so you can imagine that, in the summertime when a lot of my friends were out gallivanting around the neighborhood doing nothing, I was helping my mother harvest and can the goods. And back then, food wasn't as expensive as it is now, but it's still relatively expensive. So we packed away a lot of things. We went to the store, but it was mainly for staples like bread, things like that. Most of the stuff that we got, like meats, we went to the farm and we got a meat order, and we packed that away into the freezer. But quasi self-sufficient family, and we were not. Everybody was pretty much like that. The zoning back then in Burlington was laid out as such. The old war homes had property like that where you could actually subsist because things were rationed, and we took full advantage of that. And it was great. It was good fun, lots of work. Of course, it was healthy. No GMO, no herbicides, all natural. So like I said, my father had to leave. He was deemed a domestic terrorist by the Soviets during the communist era, and the penalty for him coming back would have been death. He would have been executed. So his reason for coming here was to save his life and to find new freedom and liberty, which he did. He always said that back then when he first came here, it was free and it was lots of liberty. That meant a lot of personal responsibility because there was no big government offering all kinds of different handouts for new immigrants back then. It just didn't happen. You might get food stamps, and sometimes we got food stamps, but otherwise you're on your own. And I really believe that spurred my mother and father to dig deep and become self-sufficient, and they did. And those values and principles they passed on to their children, namely me and my brother, and we continue with those same values and principles in my family. But bottom line, my mother and father both came here because they saw that this was a country of opportunity. It was still relatively young. There's hope to thrive if you worked hard, and they did, and that was realized, and so that's why they came here. Oh yes, yeah. So the process wasn't as daunting as it is now. I mean, the immigration process in Canada is broken. There's people on a waiting list now for 5 years or more. And they have all the credentials and qualifications to come, but there's a backlog. And even in places such as a revolution from where my mother and father came from, these people are stuck. So back then, I'm assuming it was probably more efficient, but immigration was very tightly controlled back then as well too. I think they only allowed 35,000 Hungarians into the country at a time, and that's it, and they capped that off. Well, certainly in terms of my father, the journey getting out of Hungary was perilous and dangerous. Like they were almost killed. Now, when they ended up in Austria, they were stuck in an old army camp, and they were billeted there for almost a year with a whole bunch of other refugees. So that was hard as well too. I mean, they were living in bunk beds, and there was no privacy. You really couldn't leave the place. My mother became very homesick, as well as my father, you can imagine, because they left everybody behind, and there was no word. There was no communicating with anybody back then to see if they were okay or what was going on with their family, and they were very worried. So psychologically and emotionally, it was a taxing time for them, not to mention they had just gone through national trauma, personal trauma as a result. But the process itself was, the immigration process was handled, I believe, with the Austrian-Canadian consulate, who were very good, right? So they were there all the time, checking on people, interviewing people, making sure that people had the things that they needed to maintain themselves while they were at the camp. So my mother and father landed here in '57. There wasn't a lot of immigrants. There was a couple of waves during the First World War and the Second World War that had come in. A lot of them had gone west, but Burlington per se and Hamilton was primarily British, Scottish, some Germans, and some Dutch. So how do I put this? I guess what surprised my mother and father the most was, despite all the promotion of Canada being welcoming and being the land of opportunity, there was still a lot of prejudice. So my mother and father were called derogatory names because it's the same old thing that happens before, right? So they came to this country to steal the jobs, and and there was prejudice against Hungarians, and that was all over the place. One particular story, my dad ended up working temporarily at the basket factory on Brant Street. It was a huge enterprise way back then. My father was there making baskets, and of course the foremen, they were all primarily British or Canadian, and they were picking on him all the time. And because he was Hungarian, he didn't know the language, and it culminated into a situation where this one day where the foreman put a lit cigarette in my dad's back pants, and burned him. And of course, there was a big fight, and my father got fired. But the fight's not the issue here. It's it was the mentality of the Canadians at that point for these new immigrants, right? So, and that was pretty much everywhere. On the flip side, there was people that were very sympathetic. So when my father and mother came to Canada, or to Burlington, he actually went to the mayor's office and said, listen, I've got a brand new baby boy. I have no money. I need someplace to stay. And I can't remember who the mayor was. Anyway, the mayor, I said, yep, okay, no problem. You're going to be part of the crew in the wintertime, as we have storms here, as we did just now. This was in the wintertime. There's a lot of trees that broke down in the parks, and they went in there and cleaned it up, and he had that for a while. So, it went back and forth that way. Of course, it got better over time because more and more immigrants were accepted into Canada, and of course they went through their own little prejudicial problems as well too. But it's kind of a rite of passage when you come here, right? Mm-hmm. So it's the way it is. You're different. You're treated differently for a while. Well, the Central Europeans are a special breed of cat. So they went. Look at my mother and father and their family. They went through the First World War, a major world depression, a Second World War that swept through their country, communist control and oppression, and then finally revolution. So these people were steeled mentally and emotionally. Yes, traumatized, but out of that trial by fire and the experience of pain, national pain, continental pain, right? They become very tough people, right? So a lot of people wouldn't understand the kind of mentality they had because they've never experienced that kind of trauma, right? So new immigrants who come from war-torn places certainly do. And we have kind of a kinship with those people. I didn't experience it myself, but of course through my mother and father's testimony, I have an appreciation for what they endured, the people that they become because of it, and the strength that they drew from it to actually prosper in Canada. Mm-hmm. So I'm a really good cook, and that I got to give that to my mother and father. And I almost exclusively cook Hungarian. So, and the reason I do that is because food and language are at the core of culture, and that's a universal thing. If you're French, you speak French and you cook French. Mm-hmm. So when I was growing up, I didn't even know English until I went to grade 1. I just spoke nothing but Hungarian because my mother and father couldn't teach me English, which was a problem. But so the traditions that my mother and father kept going here was, of course, Hungarian foods. We spoke the language, and when I became a little bit older, like I mentioned, there was a community of people here that were Hungarians. A lot of young couples with young children my age, and we spent a lot of time at the church. Eventually, I was recruited into the Hungarian Scouts. Right, so spent a lot of time there, and I spent a lot of time at Hungarian school every Saturday while my friends were off at hockey practice or whatever. I was in Hungarian school learning Hungarian language, and then right after that there was of course Scouts. So it was a pretty intense thing for me growing up. As much as I was in the English school system here, I was also in a Hungarian school system elsewhere. Mm-hmm. And this is very common from my observation, is that I was first generation immigrant from an immigrant family, right? And I was totally immersed in the culture that my mother and father brought from their country. I have children as well too, and as much as I have talked to them in Hungarian, they don't know Hungarian, right? I cook Hungarian food. They love my Hungarian food, but they are now a generation removed from the original homeland. They're Canadians, right? And that's the way they behave, but they don't forget their roots, right? So they know the story of their mother or their grandmother and their grandfather, and before that. So they honor that that lineage, but they are truly Canadians, right? So I've been back about 3 or 4 times now. So the first time I went back, I was around 12, and it was still communist controlled. So the communist Hungary had declared an amnesty for all the rebels of the revolution. So my father was now, he was no longer under threat of execution and arrest. So we went back, to visit the families, right? So when I was there, and I know a lot of people can't understand this kind of thing, but it was communist rule. So it was very authoritarian, very controlled, and of course with that kind of communist economy, there was shortages, the quality was poor, people lived in fear of people ratting on each other, and that happened all the time. It was just a very oppressive thing, but I learned that from a very age, that where I lived was free, right? So my like I said, my mother and father were deeply involved with the church, so that was huge. But my father was also involved with some community things here. My dad was very much involved with youth soccer when I first started up here. At one point, there was no soccer, and then I think it was in the late '60s. It started up under the police association, and my father was helping to coach and ref and do linesman things. My dad was a semi-professional soccer player back in Hungary and Austria, so it came naturally to him. Of course, he spurred me on to be a soccer player as well too, and I did become that. I also wanted to play hockey, but he had no idea what that is. But I do know that my mother and father both were part of like the couples club at the church, so they got into that to help other young couples sort of, immerse themselves into the community, not the Canadian one, but or the Canadian one and the Hungarian one as well too. So, well, I kind of followed in my father's footsteps. I coached and played in the Burlington soccer league here. I played in the Premier Division until I got a little bit too old to play that anymore. I'm very politically active now. I've actually ran for provincial office here in Burlington as a libertarian twice. Unfortunately, that didn't come to any fruition. But it was a great experience. I got to meet a lot of my Burlingtonians right at the door through canvassing. So I continue to do that now with to the Conservatives. I've been on many Conservative electoral district boards, probably for 25, 30 years now, and so supporting the candidates and doing outreach in the community. Of course, I belong to the Burlington Gun Range as well too. I'm a relatively new member there, but when I used to shoot at the Silverdale Gun Range, I would always take new people there to shoot. Burlington has changed radically since I've been here. So when I was growing up here, Burlington was semi-rural. We had a small little downtown, but everything else was orchards and quasi little farms and green areas, and it was beautiful. It really was. We would go running off into the woods, and we'd be out there all day building forts and digging tiger pits and having all kinds of fun, right? So, of course, over time, I think it was probably in the mid-'70s, things switched. A lot of developers came in, knocked down a lot of the farms, bought up a lot of the farmland, and Burlington was on its way to being transformed from a town to a fully urbanized city. How do I put this? I've lived here all my life, right? But Burlington's lost a little bit of its soul because it's become big. When I was a young man, I could go to the Burlington Mall because there was only one mall, and I was there for the opening. If you ever went to the mall, like a lot of young kids do now, I'd see all my friends there. I'd see all my friends' parents there. Now when I go to the Burlington Mall and to the, the Mapleview Mall and all the other malls, I don't see anybody anymore, right? Sadly, a lot of Burlingtonians from my generation, well, they're dying off, but I mean, a lot of them left. But even the ones that remain here are now, they've been dispersed amongst, well, the new Burlingtonians that have come here in the last several decades, right? So, that's a very poignant question to ask me right now, because we are bringing in a lot of people into this country right now. Like I said before, Canada was very welcoming at one point in time, but they were also reserved with how many people they would absorb into society, so it wouldn't cause disruption. Sadly, our federal government has missed that lesson, and we are, and it's not just me saying this, there's a lot of people that are coming here, and we're letting them in. A lot of them are unvetted. My sister-in-law was part of the immigration process, and she testified to this, that they're all fast track to get in here. And they come, right? But it's not like it was, right? They can't be absorbed so readily as previous waves of immigrants have. They're finding it hard to find work. They're finding it hard to find housing, doctors, everything else, right? Even community. So, probably not going to like this, but actually, I'll turn this around. Okay, so there's a lot of young people here that grew up here, okay, that are leaving. They're going to the States or elsewhere. My own daughter has said, I can't thrive here anymore, Dad. And she's right. My house in the Orchard is now over $1 million. There's no way my young daughter, even if she's married at this point in time, is going to be able to afford $1 million home. And sadly, Burlington, that's the average price. There is no more affordable housing, according to the circumstance. Nobody's against immigration, but when it's causing chaos, and despair, especially for people that are coming here, right? And that's wrong. That needs to be redressed. Like, people come here, the great denominator is hope. So they lost hope where they were. They came to Canada to fulfill that hope. And for decades, that hope was real. It was fulfilled. I believe that hope now is in jeopardy here, especially on the trajectory that we're on. If we continue to do what we're doing, you're not going to see people wanting to come here anymore. Just despite what the government says, yes, we are this and that and the other thing. I mean, that's propaganda from the 50s, right? They're not telling them that there's no houses here. They're not telling them that they're going to be stuck into a low-paying job where they can't even pay their hydro bill, where they'll have to choose between eating and medication, maybe, right? Sadly, that's where it is. And a lot of them end up outside of the whole network of things, and they end up in tent cities. I've never seen this in my life in Canada until now. I went to Hamilton a couple of times. There's whole parks that have been inundated with people living in tents. I have never, ever, ever seen that in Canada. That's not a good thing. Now, I think if you showed immigrants trying to come to Canada a couple of these tent cities, I think they'd probably rip up their application. Despite my lamenting about, and I've been here, okay, so I've seen the evolution and the de-evolution in terms of immigration, okay, and life here in Canada. We used to have a thriving middle class, right, and it was expanding. But now, because of political ideology, I guess you want to put it that way, the middle class is shrinking again, right? That is the engine of Canada, the middle class. So now we're ending up with people that are very rich and the ones that are very poor, and a shrinking middle class that's footing the bill. It's a formula for disaster. Now, having said that, I'm a true staunch Canadian, and a lot of my friends have already left. You know, they're living in Costa Rica, Portugal, all over the world. They just had enough, right? I had a couple of friends that left BC. They couldn't sustain there anymore, right? They came to Ontario, and now they can't even buy a home here. Here's what I got to say. I'm a Canadian, and there's two things that you can do when you're in a difficult situation. You can run away and leave that problem behind, hoping that there's greener pastures someplace else, which is rarely the circumstance. Or you can stay and fight and make it better. And that is my promise to the next generation, that I am going to stay here until we turn back things the way it was, so that when the immigrants look at Canada again, they can look at it with hope.